And it is a great pleasure for me to introduce to you today Professor José Cossa, a fellow Mozambican, although, or a conterrâneo, as we say, although I think I've been a Mozambican for slightly longer than he has. José Cossa is a multifaceted scholar, writer, researcher, poet, blogger, Twitterer, podcaster, and entrepreneur. He holds a PhD in cultural and educational policy studies with a concentration in comparative and international education from Loyola University, Chicago. And he is an associate professor in the College of Education at Penn State University. He is also a co-founder of AI4, number 4, Africa, which brings together a team of innovators who seek to include African voices, perspectives, and experiences in the artificial intelligence debates and to use emerging technologies to develop societies. José Cossa's book, Power, Politics, and Higher Education, International Regimes, Local Governments, and Educational Autonomy, received the 2012 Joyce Kane Award for Distinguished Research on People of African Descent. His research, speaking more broadly, focuses on adult online and distance education and education in Africa. More specifically, he's interested in the power dynamics informing negotiations over educational policy. He's interested in unveiling issues inherent to the promise of modernity and working towards decolonizing, debordering, de-peripherizing, and decentering the world. His additional research interests include higher educational policy and administration, system transfer, international development, and global and social justice. He's published numerous articles on these and related topics. In his current research, Professor Cossa is engaged in a new theorizing, and by new he means exterior to modernity. And I think he'll explain that to us in the next half hour or so, 40 minutes or so. And he designates this new theorizing as Cosmo-uBuntu, which is in the title of his talk today, and it is the topic of today's lecture. And you have it on the screen, but I'll read it to you. It's Cosmo-uBuntu, Theorizing in Practice and Education, Adult Online and Distance Education in the Movement Toward Debordering, Decentering, De-Peripherizing, and Decolonializing. Please join me in welcoming Professor José Cossa. Thank you. The floor is yours, José.
Muito obrigado, meu conterrâneo, Luis. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I want to also, just a shout out to my good friend here, Reginald Royston, who is also a colleague in AI for Africa, which is a collaborative that deals with artificial intelligence from the perspective of, through Cosmo-uBuntu lenses and Ubuntu, and looking at Africa as, just kind of really looking at issues of justice in the space of artificial intelligence. And also, Marissa Newman, thank you for your reading there too. So some names that I recognize. I'm sure there are many others here that might be people that I know. So I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, so the talk is on Cosmo-uBuntu, Theorizing and Practice in Education, Adult Online and Distance Education and Movement Towards Debordering, Decentering, and De-Peripherizing. And this is really, based on some of the reflections I've had about, there's been so much change in the space of online education and as well as distance education since COVID and so on. And what I'm going to do here is really to offer some reflections. It's not to give a lecture on this subject, but to offer some reflections as I'm wrestling with some of these things and see if we can, have a conversation about it, but also for future work, some of us here might be interested in doing, together as a collaboration. So Kofi Annan has said that by 2050, more than 1 in 4 people on our planet will be African. So bold action is needed now to ensure that all of them have a fair chance of leading healthy, prosperous, and fulfilling lives. So what this means is that the 3 people out of 4 are likely to think of the African in the group as a person from the periphery, even if they themselves are labeled by someone else as members of the periphery, and so, or belonging to the periphery. And so, since this course is on center, periphery, and nerd in an obfuscated understanding of center and periphery, the intentionality in removing the labeling of certain parts of the world as the periphery is part of a movement that I call de-peripherizing and decentering, and also decolonializing eventually, or ultimately, movement. So this is part of the big issue for me, is that we still label people as being part of a certain center and the center periphery. And many times, you know, what that reflects is there is some sort of a dominant perception or understanding, hegemonic sort of understanding about what constitutes a center, what constitutes a periphery. And even in that, we're still having to wrestle with those kinds of discourses because of how this isn't particularly very clear to in a lot of situations. So the opportunity here is that the adult education and online and distance education, if engaged in this intentionality, can shape the adult learner who is in a position to shape future generations' discourse and consequently action. So we need to intentionally be thinking about the center periphery binaries and what do they mean to us and so on. And hopefully that's going to help us to then, as adult learners, to continue this discourse and shape what the next generation is going to look at, and when it looks at these ideas of center and periphery, if they're going to dismantle them altogether, or if they're going to continue to perpetuate because we perpetuate or help perpetuate them. So adult online and distance education through dialogical reflexivity is a space where learners across geopolitical contexts can be grounded in the epistemological nuances characterizing discourses on center periphery. Because of the fact that we get more people involved in the educational process at the same time from different geopolitical spaces, there is this opportunity for us to look at the epistemological nuances and that characterize this binary. So the proposition here that I make is that Cosmo-uBuntu offers a new space for dialogue, conversations, engagements about theory, policy, and practice. So adult online and business education is a vehicle through which global dialogue can be practiced and nurtured. So in embracing the woke possibility, adult online and distance education has to be cognizant of its potential to be a tool for dialogical reflexivity and co-learning for students in diverse geopolitical contexts experiencing cutting-edge phenomena simultaneously. So we shouldn't look at it as simply a spread of education as a way to provide people, you know, opportunities for some sort of social mobility and so on, but also look at it in this particular space of dialogical reflexivity and co-learning, not a learning that comes from one side to the other, but it's really a co-learning space, a symbiotic space for students in diverse geopolitical contexts experiencing these sorts of phenomena. And we've seen a lot of social movements, we've seen a lot of things that, you know, Black Lives Matters and issues related to Blackness and anti-race, anti-Black kinds of racial things. And that's not an American phenomenon, that's pretty much a global phenomenon. And we've seen these things that are being experienced simultaneously across the world. And so the danger in this space of adult online and distance education, as it is the case in the face-to-face kinds of education, is that the lingering colonial debris, what I call lingering colonial debris, and the theoretical colonialism, you know, two terms that I use in my work, is that as educators, we have to remember that the pervasive theories that we tend to use, including the critical ones. And I usually use the box of modernity, and you look at the critical theories as modernity as a box, as a metaphor, and critical theories being at the margin, right at the borders there. So some of those theories are still within the kind of that box. So we have to remember that the pervasive theories we tend to use, including critical ones, and the legacies of colonialism and neocolonialism continue to inform and shape education. And it doesn't matter where you are, this is still a fact, still present. So adult online and distance education can foster a dialogical community of learners whose contexts are shaped by these theories differently, and experience the legacies of colonialism and current neocolonialism from different actual, on the moment, geopolitical and historical lenses. So it's not one context informing the other, but it is actually looking at in these different contexts and learning from them. It can also provide a space for dialogical reflexivity in which students share about their contextual experiences and learn from their colleagues. Students in the US, for instance, Brazil, South Africa, Mozambique, Egypt, different parts of Asia, can learn about historically rooted race and gender issues from one another's contexts. And so, having looked at all these things, and then the theorizing, especially the lingering colonial debris and the theoretical colonialism, I've asked the question of why do we constantly try to work in the space of justice from a theoretical lenses that are provided by the West and the modernist context? If that's the very context that created colonialism, that nurtured colonialism, that sustained colonialism up to this day. So we keep trying to remedy the situation using the very same weapons of the oppressor. And that's been problematic to me. And it's been very common also assumption that there's nothing happening outside of that box of modernity, outside of that space in terms of theory. So, and I've made arguments in other writings and in some of my writings that we have all these sojourners, you have the Marxist theories, we have all the Foucault's, all of these things going, theories and theorists, ideas going to these spaces that are outside of the modernist box or modernist box, and interpreting, explaining the reality of those and theorizing for these contexts. And so I have to ask myself, so where is the problem here? And in all of these musings and soulful searches, I did what I call a response to a calling, ancestral calling. And it is really looking at the space from which I am from, Africa, the context of Africa, which is exterior to the modernist space. Now, that's not to say that Africa does not have the modernist theorizing. As I just said, the sojourners have been everywhere and interpreted our independencies, helped us to, through all those things. And some of it was good, some of it wasn't, but the perpetuity of the theoretical colonialism is inherent in all of these attempts to use these sorts of theorizing. So Cosmo-uBuntu then was born. And Cosmo-uBuntu comes really from this urge of how we understand human has implications on how we relate with and treat the human. So in looking at all the theories that we apply in grad school and in other kinds of contexts in education and social justice and so on, I realized all these theories are really looking at the human from a very modernist perspective. Most of the pervasive ones, I'm not saying all of them that exist, but the ones that are dominant are still looking at the human from a very modernist perspective. So how we understand the human has implications on how we relate with and treat the human. It has consequences on theories, policies, practices directed to the human. And so it was the humanist perception of the human that created, nurtured, and imposed itself on the other, thus disregarding the cosmology that emanated from the world of its brainchild, the other, whose abode is the exterior space. So I'm not arguing that those societies in the space experiment were created by modernity, but that the concept of the other is a result of modernity's exclusivist perception of itself, us versus them. So as theorizing and practice in education that is exterior to modernity, Cosmo-uBuntu is a non-discriminatory and non-hierarchical understanding of human that derives from African cosmology, Ubuntu, which is described in the motto, a person is a person unto, with, because of persons. So personhood is contingent on fellow person, not on the other. And I intentionally do not use the word other. And there's a lot of translations of this motto that are modernist, and they still caught up in that entrapment of modernity. They still say, I am because we are, a person because of others. And I avoid that intentionally because it's not the spirit of what this motto is about. So Cosmo-uBuntu is the voluntary embracing of Ubuntu as a foundational value system in our participation in planetary conviviality, the embracing of Ubuntu as our perception of humanness and a worldview that informs our conviviality without forcing universality. Why is it voluntary? So some people might say, because they may, there may be a misunderstanding. People think, okay, so this Cosmo-uBuntu and Ubuntu seem to be forced into this, and now modernity has to embrace it. There's nothing forceful about it. So I always give that narrative of the early encounter of Africans and Europeans, where the question was, so who are you? And the answer was Bantu. So we're people. And because of the modernist idea of classification, the hierarchies and so on, the immediate response and an interpretation of the European settler, the eventual settler, was, oh, so you are the Bantu people. And so suddenly we have the Bantu people in Africa, but Bantu really means people. So we are human beings, just as you are human beings. So there's no exclusivist perception of personhood there. And there is no othering in this particular encounter. And this is why Cosmo-uBuntu becomes essential, because it is an offer, a gift to the world to embrace or not to embrace it, And so in Cosmo-uBuntu, personhood applies to all humans and precludes individuation, classifications, and hierarchies. In other words, humans are humans because of humans. Thus, race, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, ethnic and or geopolitical origin, etc., are incommensurate categories. These categories, which feel at home within the box of modernity, might be relevant to the entire exterior. And when we interpret the exterior through the lenses of modernity, we will force that perception that even in that exterior, there is this very sort of categorizing and classifications and hierarchies. But if we begin to try to understand those contexts for what they are and what they offer, we might find a whole different reality there. And so, and more could be said about that. So Cosmo-uBuntu theorizing and practice enhance a justice-driven agenda, which can serve as a vehicle to raise learners' wokeness, which is sort of conscientization, foster multi-context collaboration, and equitable participation locally and globally, and also counter epistemic violence, or what I call a propensity towards epistemic genocide. And I say it's an attempt at epistemic genocide because not just epistemic violence. And in my writing, I do make the argument that the epistemic and the geno are not separated in the context of Cosmo-uBuntu, because when you understand an Ubuntu, personhood is linked to land, it is linked to the cosmos, it is linked to the spirit, and so on. So when you eradicate or kill or undermine the epistemic, you are undermining full personhood, not just the mental process of how we know what we know, but it's also an entire, so you basically trying to eradicate an entire race in that way. And more can be said about this. And so what are the implications to adult online and distance education? Considering that in this space, so we notice with social media and so on, that people many times forget that what goes on online is still human activity. It is not ET activity, it is really human activity. And so suddenly they take on a different persona and say things they wouldn't say face to face and so on. If we think of it in terms of an Ubuntu perspective and Cosmo-uBuntu theorizing, we think of the online activity being initiated in the human process, in the human communication, in the human intentionality. And so what happens in distance education and online education is still very person-centered, very human-centered. And we need to be thinking of that in that same way. So the premise that access to technology, robust connectivity, and technological literacy are essential to establishing sustainable online and distance education systems and programs is a very pervasive premise. So we just have to give access. We have robust connectivity. We've seen so much of this issue, and I was in Cairo when COVID hit, and so some students were having issues with connectivity and so on. And it's not, it's really not easy for, for people to just, to just access these things because sometimes they just don't have the means. And so it becomes important then that we have to think about this premise a little bit more critically. So while that premise makes that claim, online and distance education are not only a matter of successfully implementing and accessing technology, particularly in so-called developing countries, or even when dealing with so-called marginalized populations in so-called developed countries. And I use the so-called intentionally because all these constructs are very modernist, very colonial, and I don't think, some countries are developed and others undeveloped. It's the way we look at what that development actually means. So online and distance education are also a space in which the politics of borders manifest. Remember the metaphor, the box, that, so you have a box, you have borders that will separate the interior from the exterior. And I didn't elaborate on this metaphor, but it's something you can read on if you're interested in this kind of work that I've been doing, kind of just get an idea of what that metaphor says. So my interest has been really in these two kinds of borders. And one of the borders being geopolitical borders. For the interest of this particular talk or conversation, so geopolitical borders and epistemological borders. So the argument is that due to advances in technologies and connectivity, online and distance education defy geopolitical borders, but face the challenge of epistemological borders. So we've been able to cross those geopolitical borders we've had for a very long time. And this has also bearing on the idea of global citizenship. So the fluidity across geopolitical borders designed after the Berlin Conference has been the yardstick to what constitutes a global citizen. And so in turn, what this does is it limits the nomenclature to those who have access who have such fluidity through tourism, with Africans faring at the bottom of the matrix. So people from US and European countries, regardless of age, they tend to have more access, be able to be fluid, to just go from country to country without necessarily having to worry about visas as much. Having been born and raised in Mozambique, I had a real struggle just going to South Africa during the apartheid times, whereas folks from different other parts of the world would come to Mozambique without any major issues. And then maybe even if they do have issues, they would not be in any way at the same level as the kinds of issues that a Mozambican would have to go to the countries next door. And up to this date, we still have these issues. So African countries are still struggling with the idea of this privilege of fluidity. So connectivity, borders, and citizenship, then when we look at that relationship, is that you have technology and connectivity that are seen as means to foster global citizenship. But with COVID, the move to remote and online teaching and learning heightens the fact that connectivity continues to showcase the digital divide and begs the question of global citizenship. So I think we were kind of relaxed, a little bit more relaxed, and suddenly about the differences and the digital divide. We were thinking in terms of social medias and things, but when education was hit, we had to think about how do we then transition to remote learning. Suddenly realized that this is actually a major challenge. It's a bigger challenge than we ever fathomed. And so it really showcases that divide and continues to raise questions about global citizenship in so many ways. So, and we often talk in terms of, okay, so the fight is for equity and access, so that we can dismantle these sorts of, do away with, or kind of enhance the global citizenship, sense of global citizenship. So we gotta give people and look into the questions of equity and access. But equity and access should not be evaluated by superficial means, such as access to schools or technology. We try to do that, and we saw that this isn't quite the case. But by the nature of the knowledge being transferred through education, overtly and covertly, and by epistemological questions surrounding the technology being used. In other words, whose culture, whose knowledge, whose technology? So when we transition to remote learning, the technology we're using, we never ask the question, whose technology is it? Many of these spaces outside of the modernist space, we're not in a position to actually, even if they had the technology, we're not in a position to compete with the major technologists of the world and different companies, the Googles and Microsofts and so on, and now Zoom and all that. So, we have to ask those questions also, because that is a question that is inherently epistemological in many ways. So culture is perhaps the most significant issue in education. Thus, in our articulations about global citizenship, we must pay attention to determinants of student access and equity that are tied to culture, which in turn is tied to cosmology, epistemology, ontology, and axiology, so values. So global citizenship is to a great extent a myth that can be easily proliferated through adult online and distance education because of its ability to defy geopolitical borders. So reflection and action that draw on Cosmo-uBuntu theorizing are required in order to work toward realizing equitable conceptualizations of and rights to education. And this reflection and action shouldn't just be limited to Cosmo-uBuntu theorizing. This is an African way of handling things, or global African way of handling things. But other spaces that exist, to other contexts that exist that are exterior to modernity, also have their own theorizings that need to come into this conversation and work toward this realizing equitable conceptualizations and rights to education. Critically informed global citizenship education is, in an online and distance education context, can support education as a public sphere that promotes justice, especially when combined with reflection and action that pursue the debordering, decentering, or de-peripherizing and decolonializing discourses on citizenship, global citizenship, and practices of politics and education. And you may notice that I don't use decolonizing because my argument is we've done a lot of decolonizing work. Decolonizing work happens even though it's very radical, is informed many times by the modernist perception of what it means to be independent and free and so on. So I use the decolonializing, and maybe I'm the only one using this term, and people, I remember editors trying to correct me on that, but I intentionally went for this term because I want to maintain that colonial in full, not as just a process of decolonizing that is more of a reformist type of a thing, but in a radical way, looking at the colonial in full and trying to deal with every little aspect of it. And so more conversations about that can occur in the future, and maybe we can do some more reflections together, maybe not today, but some other time. So to mitigate mitigating technology access and epistemic vantage point, adopt online disintegration in a movement towards the boredom, decentral or De-Peripherizing and decolonializing must continue to pursue more justice-driven means to defy geopolitical borders and dialogical reflexive engagements that defy epistemological borders and nurture a Cosmo-uBuntu informed justice. ICTs and distance learning resources such as massive online courses, open educational resources, mobile learning, learning management systems, and education management information systems have defied geopolitical borders. The use of blockchain technology, cryptocurrency, and Fintech and AI will continue to do that. However, mitigating the epistemic vantage point will necessitate intentionality in online and distance education to forge equitable partnerships that mitigate the epistemological conundrum. There are many tech hubs addressing the geopolitical borders, but little is being done in terms of epistemological violence, translation as erasure, and potential epistemological genocide in those spaces outside the box. And translation as erasure is a term used by Vasquez. So, thank you very much. I look forward to conversations. I think I have to stop.